There's a sound you either know or you don't. It's somewhere between a dentist's drill and a hornet's nest. Mechanical, alive, and if you heard it coming from a neighbor's backyard on a Saturday afternoon in 1963, you dropped whatever you were doing and ran toward it. That was the Cox 049, a two-stroke glow-plug engine barely bigger than your fist, running on a methanol mix that smelled like model glue and summer. It powered balsa planes, control line fighters, little tether cars that screamed in circles on the driveway. For about 30 years, it was the engine of American childhood. And then it was gone. Leroy Cox. Leroy Cox started out making wooden pop guns in his garage in Santa Ana, California, 1945. The war had just ended. Metal was still scarce, and Cox was employing neighborhood housewives to assemble toys from whatever materials he could source. By 1946, metal was available again. Competitors flooded in with cheaper versions of everything Cox was making. So he moved on this time to metal tether cars. Little toy cars attached to a string, driven in circles by a small engine. Kids loved them. They sold well enough to keep the lights on and gave Cox something even more important: experience working with miniature engines. By 1950, Cox was ready to try something bigger. He pulled his team into a workshop and didn't let them leave. Himself, an engineer named Mark Meir, and a designer named Bill Fogler. 7 days a week. Day and night. 8 months of work. The result was the Space Bug, 049, Cox's first model airplane engine, finished in October 1951. It went into full production in 1952. And it immediately caused problems for everybody else in the business. The Space Bug wasn't just another model engine. It was reliable, compact, powerful for its size, and priced aggressively. Other manufacturers started complaining. Some of them started losing customers fast enough that complaining became the least of their problems. In 1953, Cox built their first ready-to-fly airplane around the engine, the TD-1. That might not sound revolutionary now, but at the time, most model aircraft required significant assembly and technical knowledge. Cox simplified the process. You bought the box, you assembled it, you went outside. That was the whole pitch. And it worked, the Babe B. But the real turning point came in 1956. An engineer named William Seltzer designed a new version of the .0049 with an extruded aluminum crankcase, simpler to manufacture, easier to start, and more reliable than much of what was already on the market. They called it the Babe B. Price tag, $3.95. At a time when other manufacturers were charging substantially more for engines that weren't as good, $3.95 was basically a declaration of war. The Babe B didn't just take market share, it changed the economics of the entire hobby. Companies that had spent years building their reputations suddenly found themselves competing against a product that delivered better performance at a lower price. Some couldn't keep up. Others disappeared entirely. What made the Babe B remarkable wasn't that it was cheap. It wasn't. What made it remarkable was that it offered genuine value. This wasn't a toy-grade engine. It was a precision-machined piece of engineering that happened to be affordable. Parents who might have hesitated at more expensive options looked at the price and said yes. Hobbyists bought one, then another, then another. Soon the Babe B was everywhere. It became the engine that introduced an entire generation of kids to model aviation. For many owners, it was their first experience adjusting a needle valve, priming an engine, and learning how fuel, compression, and combustion work together. Sometimes it started on the first flip. Sometimes it took 20. Either way, when it finally caught and screamed to life, you felt like you'd accomplished something. That feeling kept people coming back. Disneyland, in 1957, Cox did something that permanently locked its reputation into American culture. They took over the flying circle at Disneyland. If you've never heard of it, Imagine walking through Tomorrowland during the height of America's fascination with the future. Space exploration was everywhere. Jet aircraft were pushing boundaries. Technology seemed capable of anything. And right there, flying overhead, were Cox-powered airplanes circling continuously around a giant track. The attraction wasn't hidden away. It was impossible to miss. Thousands of visitors watched those planes every single day. Kids stopped and stared. Parents stopped and watched with them. The sound of dozens of tiny engines buzzing through the air became part of the Disneyland experience. And conveniently, there was a hobby shop nearby stocked with Cox products. The marketing value was enormous. Families would watch the planes fly, then buy one before leaving the park. Back home, kids tried to recreate the same experience in local parks, schoolyards, and backyards across America. For 8 years, from 1957 to 1965, the flying circle served as one of the most effective product demonstrations ever created. Most companies dream about that kind of exposure. Cox had it every day. By the time the attraction closed in 1965 to make room for Tomorrowland's expansion, the company no longer needed it. The brand was already everywhere. The golden era, through the late 1950s, the 1960s, and deep into the 1970s, Cox became the default answer to a simple question: what engine goes in a model airplane? Millions of engines sold. The Down 49 became the most common half-A-class engine in the world. And it wasn't just airplanes. Cox made tether cars, racing boats, experimental vehicles, and even systems for launching RC gliders. The little engine became a platform, a mechanical heart that could power almost anything. The company kept refining the design. The Golden Bee, the Reed Bee, the Super Bee, the TD. Each version served a different purpose. Some focused on reliability, others focused on performance. The TD series, in particular, became famous among serious competitors who wanted every last bit of speed and efficiency. Then there was the Black Widow. The story goes that a few Cox engineers were experimenting after hours, mixing and matching parts from different engines to see what would happen. The result looked unlike anything else in the lineup. Black crankcase, red spinner, more aggressive performance, a name that sounded like it belonged on a muscle car. The Black Widow had no real reason to exist beyond being cool. But sometimes that's enough. It quickly developed a reputation as a high-performance combat engine and became one of the most beloved products Cox ever produced. Decades later, collectors still hunt for them. Throughout this era, Cox engines became more than products. They became rites of passage. Kids learned patience trying to start them. They learned responsibility by maintaining them. They learned mechanics without realizing they were learning mechanics. A generation grew up understanding engines because of Cox. The beginning of the end. By the early 1980s, the world around Cox was changing. The engines themselves were still good. The problem was everything else. Radio-controlled aircraft were becoming cheaper, more capable, and easier to use. For years, control line flying had been one of the easiest ways to get into model aviation. But now people could fly aircraft they could actually steer. The future had moved. And for many younger hobbyists, control line models started to feel like yesterday's technology. At the same time, attitudes toward childhood risk were changing. The 1950s and 1960s had embraced hands-on hobbies that involved tools, engines, chemicals, and occasional injuries. Parents generally accepted that scraped knuckles and minor cuts were part of learning. The 1980s looked different. A glow engine fueled by flammable methanol, started by flicking a spinning propeller with your fingers, became a harder sell than it had been 20 years earlier. There was also a less dramatic but equally important problem. The hobby stores were disappearing. For decades, Cox depended on specialty hobby shops. These stores stocked fuel, replacement parts, glow heads, propellers, repair kits. Most importantly, they stocked knowledge. If something broke, somebody behind the counter usually knew how to fix it. As shopping habits changed and big box retailers expanded, many of those stores closed. Without hobby shops, the hobby became harder to enter. And without new people entering the hobby, the market continued shrinking. The ownership spiral. Cox itself went through a series of ownership changes that reflected the industry's struggles. LM. Cox Manufacturing became Cox Hobbies. Then Cox Products. Then more reorganizations followed. Eventually, in the late 1990s, the company was sold to Estes Industries, the model rocket company best known for introducing generations of kids to rocketry. Estes made a genuine effort. Production continued. Classic engines remained available. New variants such as the Killer Bee and Venom were introduced. The company clearly understood the value of the brand and the loyalty of its customers. But nostalgia couldn't reverse market trends. The kids who had grown up with Cox engines were adults now. Many still loved the hobby. Some became collectors. Others introduced their old engines to their children. But the number of new participants entering the hobby wasn't enough to sustain the business the way it once had. Year after year, the market became smaller. Finally, on February 7th, 2009, Estes Industries stopped producing Cox engines entirely. After more than 6 decades of continuous production, the line shut down. The remaining inventory was sold off. For many enthusiasts, it felt like the end of an era. Because it was. 64 years. From Leroy Cox's garage in Santa Ana to a quiet inventory liquidation in 2009. That's one remarkable run. The legacy. Here's the thing about Cox 049s. They don't die easily. The engines are simple enough that a well-maintained example from the 1950s can still run today. And many of them do. Collectors buy, sell, restore, and race them. Original Space Bugs, Black Widows, and unopened Babe Bs regularly change hands among enthusiasts. Some command prices that would have seemed absurd when they were new. An engine that once cost $3.95 might now sell for hundreds of dollars. Not because it's rare, because it means something. There are still active communities dedicated entirely to Cox engines. People debate fuel mixtures, compare performance figures, share restoration techniques, track down obscure parts, and help newcomers bring forgotten engines back to life. The knowledge never disappeared. It simply moved online. Leroy Cox started with wooden pop guns in a Santa Ana garage. He ended up creating one of the most successful model engines ever built. An engine that flew at Disneyland, dominated its category for decades, and gave millions of kids their first real experience of making something mechanical work. The Thauto 49 is gone from store shelves. The hobby shops that stocked it are mostly gone. The Flying Circle is long gone. But on any given weekend, somewhere in a backyard or on a flying field, somebody still got one running. They're adjusting the needle valve, tuning the fuel mixture, flipping the propeller, waiting for that moment. And when the engine finally catches that sound, high-pitched, mechanical, and completely alive, it's exactly what it always was. A tiny engine, doing exactly what it was built to do.